Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today the question is, can video games cause post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD? Now this is an interesting question because if we look at the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, one of the criterion in terms of determining if a stressor qualifies as a traumatic event, in terms of the definition of PTSD, involves repeated exposures to information related to a trauma. And media, television, movies, pictures, could qualify under this criterion only if the individual being exposed to these stressors is working, only if it's work-related. So when we think of video games, we typically don't think of playing video games as part of a job. So if someone had to play video games that were potentially traumatizing as part of their work, well, then technically video games could be a qualifying stressor for post-traumatic stress disorder. That doesn't mean that video games could cause PTSD. It means in terms of the definition of PTSD, a video game under that circumstance could be used for that criterion. There are other criteria that of course would have to be met. Another related question to this involves video games and people that are diagnosed with PTSD. So let's say that somebody was involved in a motor vehicle accident and because of that they develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Would it be a good idea, would it be practical for that individual to play realistic video games, realistic simulations that involve crashing or racing cars? Or if somebody was a combat veteran and they develop PTSD because of their experiences in combat, would it be a good idea to play video games that are simulators of military experiences, of combat? So this is really a question of triggers. Is it a good idea to introduce triggers that could potentially bring about more symptoms if somebody has PTSD? And there isn't really clear evidence here in terms of research one way or the other. I think it's worth considering here that video games are becoming increasingly realistic. They're becoming more effective simulations of what's really happening in the real world. And it's reasonable to assume that some of the content in these video games could trigger somebody that has post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think it warrants being cautious. So generally, when we think of post-traumatic stress disorder, we do think it's a good idea to avoid activities or events that could represent a trigger. Now in therapy with a qualified mental health clinician, sometimes techniques are used like imaginal exposure that could be triggering. But that's done by somebody qualified in a controlled setting, and typically something like a video game would not be used. Although you could make an argument that that's something that should be considered for therapeutic techniques. If we can conduct research in that area and it's shown to be effective, there's nothing to say automatically that video games should be excluded from treatment. But triggering post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms outside of a clinical setting is really a whole different thing. And again, we usually think of that as something that should be avoided. So with the issue of video games and post-traumatic stress disorder, especially considering how realistic video games are, it may be a good idea in most situations to be considerate of that fact that these games are very realistic and that they could represent a trigger before playing them, particularly if someone has post-traumatic stress disorder and the game is related to the trauma that was involved in that disorder. I hope you found this description of video games and PTSD to be interesting. Thanks for watching.